Have you ever seen a seemingly ordinary person reveal incredible strength when trouble strikes? In the highlight of our story, our fat farmer springs into action under a dimly lit barn, outnumbered and armed only with his keen instincts and a rifle. A sudden flash of lightning illuminates his unwavering silhouette as he disarms one attacker with a single fluid motion. That moment, an unassuming hero standing against formidable cartel enforcers, perfectly captures the electrifying core of this tale. Curious how a peaceful farmer becomes the town's unexpected defender? You won't want to miss the showdown that unfolds next. If you're eager for more thrilling twists and heart-pounding scenes, be sure to watch until the very end to see just how our hero outsmarts a powerful criminal network. And don't forget to subscribe to Farmer's Story for more captivating narratives about everyday people overcoming extraordinary odds. Hit that subscribe button now to support our channel and join us for many more exciting tales to come. Harvest Ridge Market always felt like an oasis of calm in a busy world. Situated on the outskirts of a small town, it boasted stalls brimming with fresh produce, jars of homemade jam, and carefully crafted souvenirs. On any given Saturday, families wandered through the lanes, chatting with neighbors and sampling baked goods. No one would have guessed that danger was about to intrude on their peaceful routine. Among the vendors stood Hank, a stout figure with a friendly smile. He wore a rumpled straw hat and an apron lightly dusted with flour. Locals simply referred to him as the Fat Farmer, a playful nickname he bore good-naturedly. They saw him as a genial man who lived alone on his farm, hauling vegetables to market in a battered pickup. What no one knew, and what would soon become painfully clear, was that Hank had once been a highly trained Delta Force operator, a man who had served in some of the world's most dangerous theaters of war. Life in Harvest Ridge was so relaxed that gossip served as the main entertainment. In recent weeks, rumors circulated about a cartel looking to expand its territory, targeting rural regions where law enforcement was thinner. Most townsfolk brushed this off as idle talk. Even if criminals passed through once in a while, the community believed there was little of value here beyond farmland. Hank, however, paid attention. Long-ingrained instincts urged him to remain vigilant. The subdued gleam in his eye hinted there was far more to him than met the eye. On this particular morning, the market bustled with its usual rhythm, children running around in excitement, a local band tuning guitars, and vendors greeting customers with wide smiles. Hank laid out crates of sweet corn and tomatoes, offering free samples to anyone who stopped by. His deep laugh and easygoing banter made him a favorite among regulars. Yet behind that affable demeanor lurked a meticulous mind, constantly evaluating his surroundings, memorizing faces, and noting unusual behaviors. Midway through the morning, Hank noticed three unfamiliar men weaving through the crowd. Their curt manner and intent gazes didn't align with the usual weekend visitors. One of them wore a sleek leather jacket despite the rising temperature. Another sported a heavy chain around his neck. The third kept adjusting his belt as if feeling for something concealed. Hank recognized the subtle signs of people who carried weapons, or at the very least, were prepared to use force. Most of the townspeople didn't pay these newcomers much attention, but Hank felt a twinge of anticipation. He told himself not to jump to conclusions. After all, strangers did pass through sometimes. Still, the men's demeanor echoed countless threat profiles Hank had encountered in his old life. Whether they were part of the rumored cartel or just troublemakers, he sensed they were here on more than a casual visit. His memory flashed back to the story's premise, something that would soon become all too real. Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander. He continued handing out samples, but his gaze lingered on the strangers, and his pulse thrummed with that old, familiar awareness. The town might have been lulled by its daily tranquility, but Hank was preparing, quietly, calmly, for what he suspected was coming next. Long before anyone called him the Fat Farmer, Hank had been known by a different name within military circles. As a young man, he entered the U.S. Army and quickly found himself selected for the elite Delta Force. Years of rigorous training and real-world missions sharpened his reflexes, honed his marksmanship, and transformed him into a living weapon. Even after retirement, some of those habits never died. He still rose before dawn, exercised discreetly, and maintained a hidden stockpile of firearms and tactical gear on his property. By the time he settled in Harvest Ridge, Hank had already seen the worst of humanity. He had lost friends in combat and carried scars, both physical and mental. The farmland offered a chance for peace, a place where he could wake up to birdsong instead of gunfire. He purchased a modest plot on the edge of town, far from busy roads. Over the years, he built a life defined by planting crops, tending livestock, and making quiet appearances at the weekend market. The persona of the fat farmer didn't arise overnight. At first, Hank's neighbors simply found him polite but reserved. He rarely spoke of his background, and whenever someone commented on his well-built arms or asked how he'd acquired them, he chuckled it off, attributing it to heavy farm work. Over time, his growing midsection and gentle presence overshadowed any lingering impression of a hardened soldier. Yet those closest to him sensed fleeting moments of something more, like the way he could predict a brewing storm or just by watching the trees, or how he always scanned exits upon entering any building. Word spread around town that Hank, though seemingly unremarkable, was not a man to be underestimated. A few recognized flickers of a disciplined past, but never pride. After all, in small communities, you respected a neighbor's privacy. Nonetheless, every once in a while, an odd rumor would surface. Someone claimed to see Hank effortlessly lift a tractor wheel or sprint faster than a man half his age when a fox snuck into the chicken coop. Those tales only added to his mystique. Recently, however, the hush-hush talk about a cartel encroaching on local turf had left Hank on edge. He'd caught glimpses of tinted SUVs prowling the main highway late at night. An old friend in a neighboring town mentioned menacing-looking strangers asking questions about farmland roads. Hank tried to keep his anxiety in check. He didn't want to alarm folks unless he was certain trouble was brewing. But the presence of three strangers at the farmer's market today felt like more than coincidence. His instincts were rarely wrong. The men's watchful eyes and guarded postures suggested a mission: scouting, intimidating, or perhaps both. Hank found himself recalling the fundamental rule of his military days: always be prepared for the unexpected. Standing by his stall, he subtly loosened his shoulders, as if stretching. In reality, he was bracing himself for confrontation. The phrase rattling in his mind was the same as the story's title: Cartel Harass a Fat Farmer at a Market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander. Little did those men realize they were about to test the wrong person. By late morning, the market was at its peak. Shoppers meandered between stalls, while a local folk band strummed cheery tunes. Groups of teenagers snapped photos, and parents kept watch over younger children darting around the tables. Hank scanned the crowd and spotted the three newcomers again. They had split up, each moving in a different direction. Whether by design or chance, they were covering more ground. One approached a stall where an elderly couple sold homemade jams. Hank watched as the stranger leaned in too close to the couple, his voice low and tense. The couple's expressions shifted from polite confusion to outright alarm. Moments later, the stranger pushed away from the stall, leaving behind a pair of trembling vendors. Hank's chest tightened with anger. Nobody bullied that couple. They were fixtures in this market, beloved for their generosity. Another man seemed to be questioning a younger stall owner about something, jabbing a finger toward the farmland beyond town. The stall owner, an anxious-looking woman in her 30s, shrugged and shook her head. Her uneasy smile disappeared when the man responded with a sneer and turned away. Hank couldn't hear the words, but he recognized intimidation when he saw it. As he rearranged baskets of corn, Hank noticed the third man scanning the perimeter. This one appeared more deliberate, checking vantage points and lanes of egress. It reminded Hank of how trained operatives assessed an area before staging an operation. The sinking feeling in his gut told him these visitors weren't amateurs. His hands tensed around a wooden crate, but he forced himself to breathe. Engaging them in a crowd could cause panic, or worse, violence that harmed innocent bystanders. Besides, Hank lacked hard evidence. For all he knew, they might be mere scouts gathering intelligence, though for what, he could only guess. He also suspected they were verifying how easily they could frighten the local populace into compliance. At one point, the man who had harassed the elderly couple wandered over to Hank's stall. He cast an appraising look at the large display of produce. Hank offered his standard greeting, voice calm and neighborly. "Interested in some corn? It's fresh from my field this morning." The stranger eyed Hank from head to toe, as if sizing him up. "Heard you got a big plot outside town," he said curtly. His accent was faintly noticeable, though Hank couldn't pinpoint its origin. Could be from across the border, or perhaps just a different part of the country. Hank shrugged with a friendly smile. "I've got enough to keep me busy, that's for sure." "You like being out there alone?" the stranger pressed, leaning forward. Hank pretended not to notice the aggression in his voice. "Suits me fine," he replied. "Quiet, good soil, nobody bothers me." The man snorted. "Might not stay quiet for long. Times change." Stepping back, he left a handful of coins on the table, not nearly enough for the produce he'd taken. Hank let him go without a word, but inside anger brewed. He could practically see where this was headed. They were testing boundaries. In a place like Harvest Ridge, most folks would meekly ignore harassment, hoping trouble would pass them by. But Hank was not most folks. As the stranger melted back into the crowd, Hank's thoughts again returned to the phrase defining the story's trajectory. Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander. If these men planned to escalate, they'd learn soon enough that intimidation wasn't going to work on him. After lunch hour, the market usually thinned out. But today, tension kept many shoppers lingering near the stalls. Whispers about the trio circulated among vendors. An older man selling honey confided in Hank that he'd overheard one of the strangers talking about securing deals. Another vendor mentioned how the men demanded information on property deeds and farmland locations. The more Hank heard, the clearer it became. They were scouting for strategic land, probably to establish smuggling routes or hideouts. Despite growing unease, no one in Harvest Ridge wanted to spark a scene. This was a community of polite, conflict-averse people. Unfortunately, that made them prime targets for predatory groups. Hank calmly reassured everyone that if things got worse, they should call the sheriff or quietly slip away. Meanwhile, he kept track of the newcomers' movements like a hawk. Eventually, the trio regrouped near the food truck area. Hank watched from a distance as they spoke in hushed tones, occasionally throwing pointed looks in his direction. He couldn't catch much of their conversation, but their body language suggested frustration. Hank surmised they'd expected an easier time intimidating the vendors. A short while later, one of them, a burly fellow with a tattoo peeking out from his shirt collar, marched straight toward Hank's stall. He made no attempt at subtlety, just pushed aside a young couple browsing tomatoes and parked himself in front of Hank. "Problem?" Hank asked evenly, noticing how the man's eyes flicked to the side, checking for allies or obstacles. The man smirked. "Boss wants to talk with you." Hank maintained his genial tone. "About what?" "You've got land, and we might need it," the stranger said. "Could be we offer you some protection. Could be you say no, and, well, that wouldn't be smart." The mention of protection was a clear shakedown tactic. Hank felt a pulse of anger, but kept his expression controlled. "Appreciate the concern," he replied, "but I can take care of myself." The man shook his head, sneering at Hank's stout figure. "Don't be stupid. Accidents happen, crops burn, livestock disappears. Trust me, you'd want someone watching your back." Nearby onlookers pretended not to listen, but the fear on their faces was unmistakable. Hank met the man's glare with a steady gaze. "I'd rather you and your friends leave. This is a peaceful town. Nobody wants trouble here." A flash of annoyance crossed the man's face. "We'll see how peaceful it stays." He leaned in, the stench of stale cigarettes clinging to his breath. "Just remember, you had your chance." Turning on his heel, he rejoined his companions. Together, they strode out of the market's main gate, deliberately bumping into a few patrons as they passed, making sure everyone felt the intimidation. Hank exhaled slowly, trying to calm the adrenaline coursing through his veins. The line between civility and violence felt razor thin. While he hoped the men would vanish and leave the town alone, a gnawing certainty told him this was only the beginning. The menacing exchange underscored the story's theme. Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander. They believed they had rattled a defenseless farmer, but all they had done was ignite the protective instincts of a seasoned operator. The last customers trickled out of the market, and the vendors packed up early. A hush settled over Harvest Ridge, as though the entire town held its breath. Worried glances darted among neighbors, Parents ushered their children away, reluctant to linger in case those strangers returned. Even the local band cut their performance short, citing sudden equipment troubles. Hank busied himself with loading his unsold produce into the back of his pickup. While he appeared calm, his mind was racing. The men had left, but the day's events pointed to one likely scenario. A cartel cell was scouting for farmland to use as a smuggling route. Hank recognized the pattern from his previous life. Criminal organizations often targeted rural areas where local authorities were too small to confront them effectively. They started with intimidation and, if unchallenged, escalated to violence. He paused to look around the now nearly deserted market. The silence felt eerie, a stark contrast to the cheerful atmosphere from just hours before. Then he noticed Marion, the retired fire department captain who ran the honey stall, hovering nearby. Marion's face reflected a mix of confusion and concern. "You heading home, Hank?" Marion asked quietly. Hank nodded. "Yeah, but this isn't over. We both know it." Marion sighed, casting a worried glance toward where the strangers had disappeared. "Should we warn the sheriff? He's got a small team, and we never deal with this kind of threat." Hank wiped the sweat from his brow. "I'll give him a call, but you know how it is. Officially, they can't do much unless a clear crime's been committed. We're stuck between letting them roam free or escalating a confrontation. Maybe if enough of us file complaints." Marion started, but he trailed off, not sounding convinced. He understood that these criminals operated in the gray areas of intimidation, rarely leaving evidence that local deputies could use to build a case. A few stalls down, an older vendor was locking up crates of handmade pottery. She gave Hank a trembling nod, as though silently thanking him for standing his ground. He offered a small smile, hoping to convey reassurance. Privately, however, he was already formulating a plan. If the cartel tried to strong-arm him or any other resident, he would be ready. Harvest Ridge might not know his real background, but they would soon benefit from the grit and tactics he'd once practiced overseas. After saying goodbye to Marion, Hank climbed into his pickup. The dusty engine roared to life, and he steered onto the road leading out of town. The farmland he called home lay about 15 minutes away, a stretch of open fields and sparse woods. He used the drive to mentally catalog what supplies he had in his hidden storage: firearms, night vision goggles, and other gear that might be necessary if the situation escalated. In his rearview mirror, he saw another vehicle pull onto the road far behind him, an older sedan, inconspicuous except for the fact that it kept pace, neither gaining nor falling back. A chill of recognition washed over Hank. He understood the tactic: follow a target discreetly, observe their location, and plan the next move. He pressed the gas pedal slightly, hoping the sedan would reveal its intent. The car lingered at a distance, not overtly threatening, but enough to confirm Hank's suspicion. They were marking him, possibly verifying his home's location. He exhaled, steeling himself for the inevitable confrontation. The entire scenario was fulfilling the premise he had desperately hoped to avoid. Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander. Except now, the conflict wouldn't just unfold in the bustling market. It might come right to his doorstep. Night settled over Hank's farm with a deceptive stillness. Crickets chirped in tall grass, and the soft glow of a porch light illuminated the gravel driveway. Hank's dog, Patch, sniffed around the yard as though sensing a change in his master's mood. In the distance, the glow of Harvest Ridge's streetlights was just visible over the treetops. After supper, Hank quietly unlocked a concealed panel inside his barn, a place he rarely visited unless absolutely necessary. Behind it lay a reinforced room containing an arsenal that would shock most civilians. He had systematically acquired these weapons and tactical tools after leaving the military, ensuring they were legally obtained but carefully hidden. He preferred peace, but if forced into a fight on his property, he intended to have every advantage. Inside the hidden space, he double-checked an array of firearms: a semi-automatic rifle with a collapsible stock, a shotgun for close quarters defense, and several sidearms he had maintained meticulously. Ammunition crates were stacked neatly. Some of the gear, like night vision equipment and ballistic vests, were relics from a time when Hank's life depended on stealth and readiness. He set aside a go bag containing medical supplies, extra magazines, and a basic comms device. If things escalated, Having a rapid response kit could make the difference between survival and tragedy. The entire time he wrestled with conflicting emotions. He didn't want to live in fear again, nor did he relish violence. But protecting himself and potentially his neighbors required a pragmatic approach. Patch let out a low growl from outside. Hank stiffened, stepping out of the hidden room and closing the panel. In the barn's darkness, he listened, body taut. Another low growl indicated Patch had sensed something out of place. Hank scooped up a small flashlight and a pistol, inching toward the barn door. The night air felt cool against his skin as he scanned the yard. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual. The gravel driveway was empty except for his pickup. Then, near a cluster of bushes at the far edge of his property, he caught the faintest glint of metal. Someone crouched there, possibly watching him. The hair on Hank's neck prickled. He moved quickly and silently, using the barn for cover, circling around to gain a better vantage. Years of infiltration training guided his steps, ensuring minimal noise. As he rounded a corner, he spotted a man dressed in dark clothing, holding what looked like a pair of binoculars. The figure stiffened as Hank emerged, but Hank kept his weapon lowered for the moment. "You lost?" Hank asked calmly, voice echoing across the quiet yard. The intruder froze, likely startled by how close Hank had gotten without detection. For a second, the man seemed to debate whether to shoot, run, or bluster his way out. Hank took advantage of that hesitation, stepping forward in a commanding stance that signaled he wasn't just some random landowner. "You got 3 seconds to explain yourself," Hank warned, his tone deadly even, "or you'll regret being here." The man muttered a curse in Spanish, then bolted across the field toward a parked SUV Hank hadn't initially seen. Hank raised his pistol, contemplated a warning shot, but decided against it. Firing now could escalate the situation prematurely, and he had no confirmation the trespasser had actually threatened lethal force. Still, the message was clear. The cartel, if this man was indeed part of it, was scouting Hank's land. They wanted to map out entry points, observe his routines, find potential vulnerabilities. Retreating to the barn, Hank felt his heart hammer. The premise was no longer hypothetical. Cartel Harass, a fat farmer. At a market not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander, tonight that dynamic had come frighteningly close to igniting a real shootout on his land. The following morning, Hank woke to an early sunrise that did little to dispel the tension gnawing at him. He had slept in short bursts, ears attuned to any suspicious sound. At daybreak, he checked the property for footprints or tire tracks. Sure enough, there were faint impressions in the soil near the bushes where he had spotted the man. Hank photographed them with his phone for evidence. A few snapshots wouldn't solve the problem, but at least the sheriff would have something tangible to review. He headed into town to speak with Sheriff Cole Patterson, a straightforward man nearing retirement himself. Patterson's office was in a modest building beside the town's only fire station. As Hank entered, Patterson looked up from a messy desk piled with papers. "Morning, Hank," the sheriff greeted, worry etched into his features. "Heard there was a ruckus at the market yesterday." Hank settled into a chair, explaining what had happened. The intimidation, the strangers, the sense that the group was scouting farmland for illicit purposes. He then described the late-night trespasser and handed Patterson the photos. The sheriff studied them with a grim expression. "This is more serious than the usual mischief," Patterson admitted. "We've had rumors of a cartel expanding operations in the region. Couple counties over, there's been talk of extortion and drug running, but nothing concrete until now." Hank nodded. "I know this isn't exactly Mayberry, but your department's not equipped for a full-scale war against the cartel either. What's the plan?" Patterson sighed heavily. "Officially, we can open an investigation, share intel with state police, maybe call in the DEA if we can tie it to drug trafficking. Problem is they need more evidence before they'll deploy resources. We're short-staffed and strapped for funds. I've got 5 deputies, most of whom haven't seen real combat. I can't send them into a firefight unprepared." He fixed Hank with a searching look, lowering his voice. "I heard rumors about you, Hank. People who saw you disarm one of those thugs at the market said you moved fast. You sure you're just a farmer?" For a moment, Hank considered deflecting, but the time for half-truths was over. "Let's just say I served," he responded. Special operations, retired now. But I know how these people operate. If we show weakness, they'll push harder. The sheriff drummed his fingers on the desk. I'm not asking for your life story, but I could use your help. At least until the state folks catch wind of how serious this is. Any advice on how to prepare? Hank leaned forward. We need to fortify potential targets, warn local farmers, and coordinate with people who can keep watch on roads at night. Train your deputies on advanced tactics, room clearing, perimeter defense. If you trust me, I can help with that. Patterson's relief was palpable. I'd appreciate anything you can do. Let's just hope it doesn't come to gunfire. Hank stood, shaking the sheriff's hand. Hope for the best, prepare for the worst. The irony of it all weighed heavily on Hank as he left the station. He had chosen Harvest Ridge to escape violence, not to stand on the front line of another conflict. But life rarely respected a person's intentions. The events at the market had already put the town on alert, yet few realized how real the threat could become. The old soldier in Hank felt duty-bound to protect the innocent, especially now that the cartel had pinpointed his land. He walked out into the crisp morning air, repeating in his mind the central irony of this unfolding tale. Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander. The cartel thought they could bully rural folk into submission. Hank aimed to prove them dead wrong without losing the peaceful life he'd fought so hard to create. In the days that followed, Harvest Ridge seemed to exist in a state of uneasy anticipation. More than one resident reported strange vehicles cruising back roads at night. The local diner buzzed with hushed conversations about new faces asking intrusive questions. While no overt violence occurred, the tension was palpable enough to keep folks indoors after dark. True to his word, Hank started helping Sheriff Patterson's team. Twice a week, he drove to a decommissioned storage facility on the edge of town where the deputies practiced basic firearm skills. With Patterson's blessing, Hank introduced them to more advanced techniques: how to move in pairs, how to navigate low-light conditions, how to handle high-stress encounters without freezing. Though some deputies were initially skeptical about taking orders from a farmer, the results soon spoke for themselves. Under Hank's guidance, their accuracy and confidence improved markedly. Meanwhile, Hank discreetly checked in on neighbors who lived outside town limits. Many owned large stretches of farmland, perfect for smuggling operations. He advised them on installing motion sensor lights, reinforcing their doors, and keeping a phone within reach at all times. Word spread that Hank knew a thing or two about security, and people quietly thanked him for his concern. No one pushed him for details. Small-town folks understood the value of privacy. One afternoon, Hank returned from a training session to find a cryptic note pinned to his front door with a knife. Mind your business. The blade was embedded in the wood, and the handwriting was little more than a scrawl. Hank removed it calmly, scanning the perimeter. The driveway and fields appeared empty, but he was certain whoever had left the message was watching from a distance, gauging his reaction. He let out a slow breath, forcing down a surge of anger. This was yet another warning shot from the cartel, an attempt to rattle him and dissuade him from helping law enforcement. He refused to be intimidated. Instead, he called Patterson, who arrived with 2 deputies, to photograph the note and the knife. The sheriff cursed under his breath. They're getting bolder. Seems they've pegged you as a threat. Hank simply nodded. Good. That means they're worried. Still, the uneasy reality set in. The cartel's attention was squarely on him now. At any moment, they could opt for direct retaliation. Hank double-checked his property lines, installed extra security cameras, and made sure each gate was locked. His quiet farmland had begun to resemble a tactical training ground. Neighbors took notice, but nobody questioned him. If anything, they felt safer knowing Hank was prepared. At dusk, he sat on his porch, rifle resting against the wall, thinking about how drastically life had changed in a short span. He had never intended to play hero, much less lead a covert campaign against a cartel. Yet the threat had found him. If the men he faced truly were part of a sophisticated criminal network, they wouldn't stop at warning notes. They had tasted confrontation at the market and seen glimpses of Hank's skill. The next time they came, it would be with more men and heavier firepower. The premise that once sounded almost theatrical, cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander, had evolved into a grim reality. Hank's best hope was to stay one step ahead, using every ounce of training he possessed to ensure the peace of Harvest Ridge didn't collapse into violence. Sure enough, the cartel soon took its intimidation up a notch. Reports filtered in about farmland vandalism on the outskirts of neighboring counties, barns torched, livestock stolen, and one farmer found badly beaten. None of it had yet touched Harvest Ridge, but the pattern was too close to ignore. It seemed the criminals were sending a message: conform or suffer. Sheriff Patterson called for a town meeting at the local community center. The turnout was larger than usual, with folks from every walk of life crowding the room. Elderly couples, who seldom left their homes, sat next to farmhands and store owners, all wearing anxious expressions. Patterson stood at the front, addressing them in a calm but urgent tone. He recapped the suspicious activities, the brandishing of weapons at the market, and the nighttime prowlers some residents had spotted. The hush in the room deepened as he explained that this was likely an organized group testing the town's resolve. Then Patterson did something few expected. He asked Hank to come forward. A murmur swept the crowd as Hank stepped up, hat in hand. Most people recognized him as the farmer who sold corn at the market, but a few had heard whispers of how he had disarmed a thug with shocking speed. "Hank's been helping train my deputies," Patterson announced. "He has experience with threats like this. I'm not at liberty to disclose his background in detail, but I trust him. If we want to keep Harvest Ridge safe, we need to be united, and we need to learn from people who know how to handle these situations." Hank cleared his throat, feeling more exposed than he had in years. "We're not here to start a militia or anything like that," he began, voice steady. "But the cartel's goal is to scare you. They want you to feel helpless, so you'll cooperate. Best thing we can do is watch out for each other. Report any suspicious vehicles. Don't hesitate to call the sheriff if you see trespassers, and secure your homes. If you're comfortable, arm yourselves legally and responsibly. Fear is what they thrive on." A small commotion arose in one corner of the room. An elderly woman exclaimed, "We've never had to deal with criminals like this. My husband and I can't just move away. What do we do if they come to our door?" Hank nodded sympathetically. "They pick places that seem defenseless, but we're not defenseless if we stand together. I'll help, and so will the sheriff and his deputies. We'll coordinate watch groups so no farm or home is isolated." The atmosphere in the community center crackled with a blend of fear and cautious determination. Despite the gravity of the situation, Hank spotted a few people sitting taller, as though empowered by the idea they weren't alone. After the meeting, residents approached Hank with questions. Some asked for advice on reinforcing doors or where to place motion sensors. Others offered quiet thanks for his willingness to step up. He answered as best he could, mindful not to promise miracles. The cartel was resourceful and dangerous, but so was a united town willing to defend itself. Leaving the center that night, Hank couldn't help but think that he'd never planned to become a local hero. His aim had been to fade into rural life, far from violence and strife. But as the story's key phrase kept echoing, "Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander," it was clear the town now saw him as something more than a simple grower of corn. Whether that new role would save them or drag them into deeper conflict remained to be seen. The next big confrontation came without warning. On a drizzly afternoon, a frantic call crackled over the sheriff's radio. Masked men had cornered two deputies on a remote road just outside Harvest Ridge. Patterson relayed the message to Hank, who immediately grabbed his gear and headed out in his pickup, rain pattering against the windshield. When he arrived, he found two patrol cars parked askew. The deputies were crouched behind their vehicles, guns drawn but clearly outnumbered. Across the road, three men, faces partially covered by bandanas, fired sporadic rounds from behind a parked SUV. Hank recognized the same body language and bearing from the men at the market, or those who had skulked around his farm. It was the cartel, making a statement of force. Stepping out of his truck, Hank ducked behind a tree. He carefully assessed distances, wind, and angles. One deputy shouted that they were pinned down. Hank motioned for them to hold their fire. Rain slicked his rifle's barrel, and thunder rumbled in the distance, adding to the tension. With measured precision, Hank fired two shots at the SUV's rear tire. The hiss of escaping air and the sudden sag of the vehicle signaled success. Alarmed, one assailant peeked out, and Hank neutralized the threat with a well-placed shot to the shoulder. Enough to wound but not necessarily kill. The man screamed, dropping his weapon. Seeing their comrade fall, the other two men tried to retreat, spraying bullets in Hank's direction for cover. One round pinged off the tree trunk near his head, sending shards of bark flying. Unfazed, Hank rolled onto his stomach and fired again, forcing the attackers to scramble behind the SUV. The deputies took advantage of the lull, flanking the men, yelling for them to surrender. A tense standoff ensued. One masked shooter raised his hands in a gesture of surrender, while the other tossed his weapon aside and bolted into the woods. A deputy radioed for backup, an edge of relief in his voice. Hank kept his sights trained on the surrendered man, ensuring no sudden moves. Rain pooled in the roadside ditches, and the metallic scent of gunfire permeated the damp air. Within minutes, Sheriff Patterson arrived with more units. They apprehended the wounded cartel member and the one who surrendered, cuffing them beside the ruined SUV. The faint wail of an approaching ambulance punctuated the scene. Patterson ambled over to Hank, his face grim. "Thanks. Could have been worse if you hadn't shown up." Hank nodded, but inside he felt a pang of regret. Every confrontation risked lives on both sides. He looked at the battered patrol cars, the trembling deputies, and the detainees. None of this resembled the quiet farmland life he had chosen. Yet he also knew that if not confronted, the cartel would ramp up their coercion, turning Harvest Ridge into a stronghold for their criminal activities. The phrase defining this bizarre chain of events was never far from Hank's mind. Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander. The criminals had discovered the truth too late, and now at least one was captured. But with that discovery came heightened risks. The cartel would surely retaliate with more men and more aggression, determined not to lose face. Back at the station, Sheriff Patterson began processing the two apprehended cartel members. Under questioning, one clammed up entirely, his eyes blazing with defiance. The other, injured and in pain, muttered a few cryptic statements in Spanish, suggesting there was someone higher up, an Esteban, who called the shots. Patterson and Hank exchanged knowing looks. It wasn't exactly a revelation, but at least they had a name. Word of the skirmish spread through Harvest Ridge quickly. While many expressed gratitude for the deputy's bravery and for Hank's timely intervention, others grew more anxious. The presence of masked gunmen so close to town shattered any illusion that this crisis might just fade away. Families started locking their doors by midday, and store owners discussed closing early to avoid being out past dark. Hank found himself stopped on the street by neighbors seeking reassurance. A weary father of three asked if it was safe to let his kids wait for the school bus in the early morning. The local grocer wondered if criminals might target his supply deliveries. Hank answered as honestly as he could, advising caution, but urging people not to abandon their normal routines entirely. Fear, after all, was the cartel's most effective weapon. During a private meeting that evening, Patterson confided in Hank that the county officials were finally taking notice. "The state police will send a small task force our way, but it could be a few days before they're fully deployed. We're also trying to loop in the federal folks, but it's a slow process." Hank nodded, tension knotting in his chest. Criminal networks like this cartel thrived in the lag time between local and higher-level responses. "We can't just wait for them to show up," he said. "If Esteban's planning a bigger move, we need to be ready. Maybe we should set up some roadblocks, or at least increase patrols around known farmland. They'll probably try to strike where we're weakest." Patterson agreed, and the pair mapped out likely targets. Areas with sparse housing, fewer neighbors, perfect for covert trafficking operations. Hank volunteered to do a nighttime drive around the perimeter of town, checking for unusual vehicles or activity. Though some of the deputies questioned why a civilian was taking on this role, Patterson trusted Hank implicitly. So far, his instincts had proven invaluable. Late that night, Hank patrolled deserted back roads. His pickup's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating endless rows of corn and soy fields. Aside from an occasional barn or silo, the landscape was empty. Yet Hank knew from experience that danger often lurked where eyes rarely ventured. He occasionally parked and switched off his lights to observe. The quiet enveloped him, reminding him of past missions where silence was both ally and threat. In the stillness, he reflected on how drastically his retirement had derailed. Instead of enjoying solitary days growing crops, he was scouting for armed criminals. The irony wasn't lost on him. The entire situation came back to that fateful premise. Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander. Now that knowledge was out in the open. The only question was how the final confrontation would unfold, and whether Harvest Ridge would emerge unscathed. He carried on his patrol, resolved to safeguard the people who had welcomed him as nothing more than a friendly neighbor. Cartels banked on fear and isolation. Hank intended to fight that with vigilance, unity, and the deadly skill set he once used to confront foes on foreign soil. For a time, the nights passed without incident. The additional patrols seemed to deter overt attacks, but the town remained on edge. Sheriff Patterson's phone rang constantly with tips about suspicious cars or odd noises. Not all turned out to be related to cartel activities. Sometimes it was just a lost tourist or a raccoon knocking over garbage cans. Still, Hank and the deputies treated every alert seriously, unwilling to dismiss any sign of potential danger. In an attempt to tighten security further, Patterson enlisted Hank's help in organizing a volunteer watch. Groups of 2 or 3 residents, each with walkie-talkies and good vantage points, would keep an eye on the roads leading into town at night. Some farmers even offered high points in their barns or silos for better observation. The watchers weren't asked to confront anyone, just to report suspicious movements immediately. Hank moved from one group to another, offering quick training on how to spot hidden vehicles, read body language through binoculars, and maintained quiet communication. Many volunteers were older men and women who refused to let the cartel terrorize them out of their homes. Their determination impressed Hank. He knew that in many war zones, local militias formed under far more desperate circumstances. Here, it wasn't quite so extreme, yet, but community resolve could still be a powerful deterrent. One cool evening, a call crackled over the volunteer channel. A farmer stationed near the East Road spotted 2 SUVs idling with headlights off. Hank, already on patrol, raced toward the location. By the time he arrived, the SUVs were gone, leaving behind deep tire tracks. No shots were fired, no confrontation took place, but the message was clear. The cartel was probing, testing the volunteers' alertness. Back in town, rumors swirled that Esteban, the shadowy leader, was furious about losing men and equipment to local resistance. Some said he might attempt a large-scale show of force, rolling in with a dozen armed thugs, or even setting fires to scare people into compliance. Hank cautioned that these rumors could be exaggerated or planted deliberately to spread panic. Still, he urged the sheriff to prepare for the worst. Then, late on a windy night, Hank's phone rang. A deputy breathlessly reported that gunshots were heard near an abandoned farmstead about 2 miles from Hank's property. Hank didn't wait. He grabbed his rifle, strapped on a vest, and jumped into his pickup. The road leading there was narrow and unpaved, flanked by dense trees. His headlights bounced over potholes, and the gloom of the forest closed around him. Reaching the property, he cut the engine and listened. Shouts echoed through the darkness, followed by a burst of gunfire. From the faint glow of a half-collapsed barn, he could see flashlights darting around like restless fireflies. The deputy who had called was crouched behind a rusted tractor, pinned down by gunmen taking potshots. Hank signaled to the deputy, indicating he'd approach from the flank. Heart pounding, he slipped through the shadows, senses keen from years of training. The memory of dusty foreign battlefields resonated in his mind, except now the conflict was in the heart of rural America. He readied his weapon, adrenaline surging. The confrontation that had been building for weeks was about to explode. And as the story's own stark tagline declared, "Cartel harass a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander." At last, the cartel was about to learn that underestimating Hank had been their gravest mistake. Lightning flashed in the distant sky, illuminating the battered farmstead. Between the cracks of thunder, Hank could hear panicked voices in Spanish. 4 cartel enforcers, armed with rifles, were using the barn's remnants for cover. The deputy behind the tractor fired occasionally to keep them from advancing, but she was clearly outgunned. Staying low, Hank maneuvered through tall weeds, circling around the crumbling barn. Rain began to fall, masking the sound of his approach. He crept up behind a splintered wall, breath steady, rifle ready. One of the cartel men was just a few yards away, scanning the darkness. Hank waited until the man turned his head, then delivered a swift strike that knocked him unconscious. A second assailant whipped around, hearing the commotion. Hank fired a controlled pair of shots, catching him in the leg and shoulder, enough to drop him. The thunder nearly drowned out the man's pained cries. Two more to go. From across the barnyard, the deputy noticed Hank's intervention. She called for backup, her voice urgent. At that moment, the third cartel member spotted Hank's muzzle flash and returned fire. Bullets splintered the wooden planks near Hank's face, showering him with debris. He ducked, exhaling sharply to stay calm. The man advanced with reckless abandon, possibly hoping to overrun Hank's position. That aggression was a mistake. Hank rolled to a new angle, squeezed the trigger, and the attacker collapsed, rifle clattering on the muddy ground. Lightning flickered again, and in that brief glare, Hank glimpsed the final threat, a tall figure aiming a pistol at the pinned deputy. Without hesitation, Hank steadied his rifle and fired. The bullet struck the gunman's weapon, knocking it from his hand. Surprised, he scrambled backward, arms raised in surrender as the deputy rushed in to cuff him. The entire firefight had lasted mere minutes, but the tension felt like an eternity. By the time reinforcements arrived, Sheriff Patterson and two more deputies, the scene was mostly under control. They found 4 cartel enforcers incapacitated or bound. One was badly wounded, needing immediate medical attention. The deputy Hank had saved was shaken but unhurt, offering Hank a grateful nod. Amid sirens and shouted commands, Patterson approached. "Hell of a job, Bob," he said, scanning the disheveled barnyard. "You saved her life, and probably a lot more." Hank lowered his rifle, the barrel still warm. Rainwater ran down his face. "They're pushing harder. My guess is Esteban was testing if they could seize this property as a base. Didn't work out for them." Patterson stared at the subdued men, shaking his head. "We've already called for additional state backup. This might convince them to send more resources." Before he could continue, headlights appeared down the long dirt road. A black SUV approached, then stopped upon seeing the police presence. For a moment, Hank thought more cartel gunmen had arrived. But the vehicle reversed wildly and sped off, tires spinning in the mud. Esteban or his cohorts had likely been en route to oversee the operation. They fled now, aware it had failed spectacularly. In the chaotic swirl of emergency lights, paramedics, and law enforcement, Hank stepped away, letting the professionals secure the scene. He felt a mixture of relief and resignation. The cartel had suffered a significant blow. With multiple arrests and an increasing law enforcement response, their grip on the region would weaken. Yet Hank also knew criminals like Esteban didn't vanish overnight. Still, for the moment, Harvest Ridge could breathe easier. The quiet farmland, so recently threatened by a violent network, had stood firm, thanks in no small part to the unassuming man at its heart. The truth was plain. Cartel Harass, a fat farmer at a market, not knowing he's a retired Delta Force commander, had become a stark lesson in underestimation. Hank looked around at the frightened but grateful faces. This community was worth defending, and he would keep defending it, however long it took. From my personal viewpoint, this remarkable journey of a fat farmer turned quiet savior shows that courage and selflessness can emerge in the most unexpected ways. Despite facing overwhelming odds and lethal threats, our hero's determination never wavered. He fought not for glory, but for the safety of his tight-knit community. By the end, we witnessed neighbors standing shoulder to shoulder, proving that unity and resolve can triumph over any darkness that tries to invade their peaceful world. This story reminds me that real strength isn't just about physical power. It's about heart, integrity, and the will to protect what matters most. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What part moved you the most? Which moment truly captured your imagination? Drop a comment below, share your insights, and let's keep the discussion going. Thank you for being a part of this adventure, and remember to stay tuned to Farmer's Story for more inspiring tales.